Many of you know from your own experience that changes in interest rates have important effects on your household and business decisions. If you're my age, you remember the late 1970s when nominal interest rates exceeded 15%. As high as interest rates were then, they did not keep pace with the rate of inflation, and real rates of interest were negative in those years. That was a time when borrowers did very, very well. And I can recall that many young householders, myself included, bought homes as soon as they could scrape together a down payment. Or perhaps you remember the early 1980s when credit market conditions were very different. Nominal interest rates remained quite high, over 12%, and as high as 14% on Treasury bills. But the rate of inflation had dropped by then in response to slower growth in the money supply, engineered by Federal Reserve under the direction of Paul Volcker. Then, the real rate was very high as 10% in some periods. Today, I ask you to think of the interest rate in a new way. I ask you to think of interest rates as market-determined prices. Yes, interest rates are prices, and economists think of them in much the same way as they think about the price of a pound of apples, a bushel of corn, a gallon of gasoline, or a haircut. In particular, economists believe that interest rates are set by the market forces of demand and supply. But what good is being priced when markets determine the rate of interest? The good in question is early use of funds. Let me elaborate a bit. What I mean by early use of funds is that a certain amount of money is allowed to be used earlier rather than later. $1, for example, or $1,000 is allowed to be used, say, 1 year earlier. That situation occurs when demanders want to use funds earlier than their incomes justify. Suppliers of that product provide early use of funds to those who will pay sufficient interest when they save. And this is the important point, equilibrium occurs at the rate of interest that makes the plans of fund demanders who want to use funds early and fund suppliers who are willing to save compatible. Equilibrium occurs at an interest rate that make fund demanders and fund suppliers' plans compatible. But interest rates are different than other prices in several important ways. First, a change in interest rate directly affects many economic markets, while a change, say, in the price of corn directly affects only a few. Second, it is through interest rate changes that central banks attempt to stabilize the economy, keeping inflation low and steady and keeping output near full employment levels. And we'll talk about how they do that later. But it's important now to realize that these first 2 points are related. The Fed changes interest rates because it can, and because it knows that interest rate changes have widespread effects. Third, a change in the rate of interest must be viewed in the right way in order to be understood. In this lecture, I will begin by explaining why it is appropriate to think of an interest rate as a market price. I will then explain in detail as to how one should view interest rates. In this part of the lecture, I will reintroduce the important concept of the real rate of interest that we encountered in an earlier lecture. Finally, I will explain how different long-run and short-run economic forces work on the rate of interest, how they affect the rate of interest. In later lectures, we will see how changes in interest rates affect stock prices, how international differences in interest rates affect exchange rates, and how interest rate policies are, at least in normal economic times, the backbone of central bank stabilization policies. The rate of interest is a very important market price. To fix ideas, let's have an example. Let's suppose that our friend Jane wishes to purchase a new automobile for $20,000. To keep things simple, we will assume that there is no inflation and that a comparable automobile will be available in 3 years for the same price. That's a good assumption, given no inflation. To allow for inflation would be possible, and in our example, we would replace nominal interest rates with the real rates of interest. Also, to keep things simple, I assume that Jane pays the same interest rate to borrow that she receives when she saves. I know that's not true, but it keeps things simple, and it does absolutely no violence to the point I wish to make. My point is valid even when I make this simplifying assumption. Let's take a look at two of Jane's options. Jane has lots of options, but I focus on these two because they're so instructive. Jane can borrow $20,000 to purchase an automobile and repay the loan in equal monthly installments over 36 months. Or she can put an equal amount of money in her savings account every month for 36 months until the balance in that account is $20,000. Okay? Now, the table you are seeing shows how the difference in cost of these two options depends on the rate of interest. So let me explain very clearly what you're looking at. In the left column, you see different potential values of the interest rate: 2%, 6%, 10%, and 14%. In the second column, you see the monthly payment required to purchase the auto now. So this would be Jane's monthly payment if she took out a loan, bought the auto now, and made equal monthly payments. And in the third and last column, you see the monthly saving required to purchase the auto in 36 months. Now, what you see is it's always more expensive to have the auto now than later, but how much more expensive depends on the rate of interest. Clearly, an increase in the rate of interest, and you can verify that by looking at the table, makes the borrowing option more expensive and the saving option less expensive when I use as a measuring stick Jane's monthly payments. Economists take the view that relative prices matter for economic decision-making and that relative prices adjust to clear markets. An example will help. Suppose that the price of a pound of apples is $2 and the price of a pound of pears is $3. The relative price of a pound of pears is 1.5 pounds of apples. This means that when a consumer chooses a pound of pears, that consumer refuses 1.5 pounds of apples. If pears are scarce relative to apples, say there's some blight, the relative price of pears should rise, let's say to 2 pounds of apples per pound of pears. If, on the other hand, pears become abundant relative to apples, then the relative price of pears should fall, say, to 1 pound of apples per pound of pears. The inflation adjusted, we call it the real, rate of interest measures the cost of goods today relative to goods in the future. Let's say 3 years. If real rates are higher, someone who buys goods now gives up more goods in the future. If the real rate is lower, someone who buys goods now gives up less goods in the future. This is precisely what we saw in the example of Jane. As the interest rate rose, she had to give up more goods in order to have her car earlier. How do we know? Her interest payments increased, and she had to finance those higher interest payments by giving up other goods she could have purchased with those dollars. Okay, this is supposed to be a story about how interest rates are determined by market forces. And in the long run, the real rate of interest is determined jointly by the patience of the population in an economy and the productivity of the nation's capital. This very important point, indeed that very sentence, was made by one of the great 20th century economists, Irving Fisher, in his 1930s book, The Theory of Interest. As an aside, that book is a good read even today and has one of the best first lines of any economics book ever written. Fisher said in the first line, "Income is a series of events." I love that line. It makes me think every time I read it. Fisher said, in the long run, the real rate of interest is determined by the patience of the population and the productivity of a nation's capital. But what did Fisher mean, first, by the long run? Well, according to Fisher, in the long run, the economy remains at full employment. In the long run, government budgets are balanced. Why? Well, if they stay perpetually in deficit, the governments go out of existence. In the long run, the economy's current account is balanced, and we better pause and see what that means. That means approximately that the value of goods and services that we import from the rest of the world in a year is just equal to the value of goods and services that we export to the rest of the world in that same year. Now, to be precisely correct, we must adjust both imports and exports by allowing for income that we earn on our capital holdings abroad and also allowing for income earned by capital holdings of foreign citizens in the United States. But you get the idea. There has to be a kind of balance between outflow to the rest of the world and inflow from the rest of the world. Clearly, the long-run world I describe is a world we rarely, if ever, see. Why is it worth thinking about? Because that long-run world is a world toward which economic forces propel us. We don't get there, but we're always moving there. We don't get there because stuff is always happening. But it's a world worth thinking about, and it's a world that Fisher used to explain the market behind the real rate of interest. What good is being priced in this market? The economic good in question is early use of funds, right? The ability to use funds early. For the sake of discussion, early use of funds can be thought of as the right to use $1,000 for 1 year earlier. What do I mean? Well, you could use that $1,000 a year later, or you could use it a year earlier. The right to use it a year earlier is the good. It's a valuable good. Being able to buy things early is a valuable thing, and it's the good that we think that credit markets price. I said that the forces of demand and supply matter. Who are the demanders? Demanders are those who have some compelling desire to use funds in excess of the funds that their income provides them. Examples include households that wish to buy a home or pay for a child's education. Examples also include owners and managers of firms that wish to build capital, that perhaps implement highly productive technologies, ideas, and business plans. The more productive, the higher the interest rate those demanders would be willing to pay. For fund demanders, however, higher interest rates are a disincentive to borrow. That's very, very important. Suppose you want to build a better mousetrap and have an idea about just how to do it. Suppose further that in order to buy the equipment and obtain suitable space to manufacture and distribute your mousetrap, you must obtain $100,000 in startup funds. The interest you will pay on these funds is a cost to you of realizing your business plan, of realizing your dream. The higher that interest rate, the higher are those interest rate costs. There's another very useful way to explain the role of interest rates in an investment decision. To invest is to spend money today and to receive in return a stream of future profits. An investment is economically rational only if the present value of that profit stream that you hope to get is higher than the current dollar outlay for your investment. And higher interest rates imply higher discount rates for those future profits and smaller values for present value. It does not matter whether you must borrow the funds or whether you already have those funds in hand. The interest rate in both cases measures your opportunity cost of using your funds to finance your mousetrap factory. Why? You could always lend the funds you have in hand to someone else and earn the rate of interest. That means that the interest rate is important to you whether you have the money in your pocket or whether you must borrow it. The other side of the market are suppliers of credit. And suppliers are those who are patient. Patient? Patient in the sense that they are willing to lend from their current income. That is, they are willing to receive interest payments and allow others to borrow a part of the income they have earned. For suppliers of funds, for those who are patient, higher interest rates are an incentive to lend. Patient people are more likely to lend than impatient people. Patience is likely to be higher when a household's income is more than sufficient to provide for food, shelter, and clothing. Patience is also likely to be higher when a household desires to make an expensive purchase in the future, again, such as a college education for its children, or a house, or purchase a retirement income. A higher interest rate is an incentive to supply funds because a higher interest rate implies a greater reward to savings. That is, a higher interest rate implies that one's savings will buy more in the future. The goods bonus to saving will be higher. In the long run, Irving Fisher's long run, interest rates tend to those values that balance the plans of borrowers and lenders. If there were more credit demanded than could be supplied, those with the most productive projects would offer to pay higher interest rates. They'll crowd out the less productive projects, but the interest rates will rise. On the other hand, if there's less credit demanded than can be willingly supplied, the most patient savers would offer to accept smaller interest rates, and interest rates would fall. Well, the long run is an ideal horizon. What about the reality in which we live? Economists refer to that as the short run. John Maynard Keynes once quipped, "In the long run, we're all dead." And what he meant was we ought to focus on the short run. So let's do that. In the short run, interest rates depart from long-run values for several very important reasons. Governments sometimes spend more than they earn in tax revenue. They run deficits. When the government sector runs a deficit, it must, as we've seen, borrow funds to balance its accounts. In doing so, the government competes with private borrowers for those scarce funds. If the government deficit increases, other factors unchanged, the demand for funds increases and interest rates rise. The rise in interest rates crowds out some investment projects. What do I mean? This is very, very important. When governments borrow more, when their deficits are higher, interest rates rise, and some investment projects no longer are sufficiently profitable to justify doing in the face of the higher interest rate. Governments are in competition with private investors for scarce funds. In the short run, nations also run current account deficits. A current account deficit is the difference between the value of a nation's imports and the value of its exports. And I've already explained there's an adjustment for income flows into and out of the country. And there's also another adjustment for transfer payments between countries such as those associated with foreign aid. But the point is inflow and outflow. When a nation runs a current account deficit, the value of its imports is higher than would be justified by its exports and therefore income flows. When the U.S. runs a current account deficit, the rest of the world, in effect, lends it purchasing power. That is, the trading partners of the U.S. are in a such situation where they prefer to take some of the dollars that they receive by selling goods to the United States and use those dollars to buy financial assets, say those issued by the U.S. Treasury, and also those issued by firms. In effect, our trading partners lend us funds. When the current account is in deficit, the supply of credit to the United States is higher than from domestic sources alone, which means that interest rates are lower if we don't allow some other factors to change. Let's look at some data and see how important that is for the United States. What you are seeing now is a timeline of our U.S. current account deficit as a fraction of our gross domestic product. And remember, we make it a fraction of gross domestic product because we want to normalize for changes in the size of the U.S. economy. The data run from 1960 all the way to 2010. And we will see that for the first half of the period, roughly, the current account was either slightly in surplus or slightly in deficit. You'd have to say that basically that account was balanced. During the 1980s, there was a sustained period of current account deficits. The rest of the world was lending us money. They were being patient for us. But by the early 1990s, that situation had corrected itself. Then a very, very important change occurred. The United States entered a period of persistent current account deficits. We routinely got more imports than we sent the rest of the world goods in the form of exports. And that situation has still not reversed. There's good news, folks, and there's bad news associated with this. The good news is that that current account deficit has kept our interest rates lower. That means that we have been able to do more investment than we would otherwise have been able to do because the rest of the world was willing to lend us money. The bad news is that eventually the rest of the world will want to be repaid. The third reason that the short run departs from the long run, that current reality is different from Irving Fisher's ideal, is that the economy is sometimes in a recession. When the economy is in a recession, demand for credit is low, in part because firms doubt that households will buy their products. And therefore, interest rates are low because demand for credit is low. In a recession, interest rates may also be low if the Federal Reserve uses monetary policy to lower them in an attempt to stimulate interest-sensitive spending. The Fed has in mind the idea that if it lowers interest rates, some investment projects would become viable. In summary, then, interest rates are important economic prices that are determined in the market for credit. In the long run, the saving and investment plans of the members of an economy will jointly determine interest rates. In the short run, other forces are important as well. Government deficits tend to raise interest rates because the government competes with private borrowers for scarce funds. It's one of the reasons why at various points in our history we have worked so hard to balance the government budget. Current account deficits tend to lower interest rates because the supply of credit is bigger than it would be from domestic sources alone. When we run a current account deficit, the rest of the world willingly lends us funds. And when our economy is in a recession and resources are unemployed, interest rates tend to be lower both because demand for credit is low and because the Federal Reserve often lowers interest rates in an attempt to stimulate spending. I have argued then that interest rates are an important market price, balancing the plans of spenders and savers, of borrowers and lenders. Thank you very much.